So thank you so much. It's a great honor to be here, and some of what I say may be a bit of a repeat from what I did on Wednesday. As Rahel was saying, it's tricky to know quite what to include and what not to include when you've already spoken, but I hope it gives a somewhat broader overview of my work. I have to say I'm very honored to be here. I know that I'm one of those people who's trying to bridge multiple disciplines and traditions and things like that. So it's interdisciplinary, it's sort of feminist, it's embedded in analytic work and also critical theory. So I feel sometimes a bit of an outlier in every community, but I feel very welcome here, and you all have been very kind and accepting of my particular configuration. So I'm very honored and pleased. Okay, so let's get started. So this is a murmuration of starlings. As I said last time, this is a complex dynamic system. And let's go. So I'll start with an introduction, then I'll speak briefly about an associationist model of society that I reject, but I think it's very common in the world of social ontology that I'm responding to. So it gives you a bit of context for some of the emphasis that I make, because this is very common in the analytic tradition. I then talk about social formation, and finally, a little bit more about the normativity of critique. So, introduction. It's clear that we all live in highly oppressive and unjust systems, and that people have tried to change them for a long time, but they do continue to reproduce themselves. So I think it's important when we're thinking about social change to think about this process of self-reproduction, homeostasis, that it keeps happening, keeps being there in spite of our efforts, and why does it do so? And then to ask about how ideology critique fits into that picture, and under what conditions does ideology critique provide a moral basis for transformative change? So I'm going to say very brief things about each of these questions. So an associationist model of society. So the associationist line of thought focuses on groups of individuals, such as committees or friends engaged in an activity together. Such associations aren't just a set of individuals, like a set in the terms of set theory, where it's just two random things, but are made up of individuals who, in some sense, share intentions. And this is a notion of collective intentionality. And I was going to read you a quote to give you a sense of what this involves from the point of view of those who are most involved in theorizing. This is from an article in I think it's the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy by Schweikert and Schmidt. And they say, suppose you intend to visit the Taj Mahal tomorrow, and I intend to visit the Taj Mahal tomorrow. This does not make it the case that we intend to visit the Taj Mahal together. If I know about your plan, I may express or refer to our intention in the form, we intend to visit the Taj Mahal tomorrow, but this does not imply anything collective about our intentions. Even if knowledge about our plan is common, mutual, open between us, my intention and your intention may still be purely individual. For us to intend to visit the Taj Mahal together is something different. So there has to be this kind of what's called, sort of, I think of it as the special sauce, but that's kind of McDonald's terminology. But there's this special thing that has to happen when we, in the relevant sense, do something together. So there has to be this mutual interconnection of our intentions that then creates the we intention, which then creates the social group. So shared intentions can also create, or collective intentionality can also create rules, conventions, and structures. So we can decide to constitute a judicial system. We can decide to form a constitution, et cetera. And it involves these we intentions that I mentioned. So this is going to be some org chart. I don't know if you call them that, organizational chart of an institution. We can create those sorts of things. And we can create society, because in fact what the associationists think is that society is constructed by us through these we intentions. here we are in our society, all happily holding hands, and we have our government here in the middle of it all. We have joint intentions to live together in a way that's good for all of us. This is according to the associationist. Accordingly, we collectively adjust our desires and actions in light of the legitimate desires of others and the conditions. So here we are, jointly intending to live together, jointly intending to form a society, jointly intending to form systems and structures, whether judicial system and whatever. And so there are structures here, but they're structures that we have created through our joint intention. We elect or appoint representatives to sort out what is the best way to carry on for the good of all. The representatives make a plan to solve our collective action problems, and they convey this to us through law, policy, and such. The plan not only provides rules for what we need to do, but reasons that we should comply given our joint intentions to live together well. It engages us as rational agents seeking to coordinate our activities. Things go wrong when we fail in some way to be rational. We have false beliefs, flawed reasoning, vice, etc. And solutions lie in the correction of agents to change their values or prevent them from discriminating. Okay, this is the standard model. So this is part of a broader work where I'm trying to talk about a social formation account of oppression rather than a discrimination account of oppression, because a lot of people think that the problem of oppression is that people discriminate against a group, and I don't think that's the right way to think about it. So within a capitalist economic system, those who sell their labor don't necessarily form a social group prior to their employment. Rather, their circumstances make it necessary for them to work a wage, and those who work for a wage are similarly positioned in the structure. They're exploited and constitute the working class. Oppression of workers happens because it's part of the structure of a capitalist economy that labor must be exploited to gain profit. It would be odd to say that capitalism discriminates based on class, as if there is a working class independent of capitalism, and capitalism discriminates against them. A capitalist economy is an oppressive system that produces wage workers and capitalists. So this is a way of thinking, it's not, the problem with capitalism isn't that people discriminate are discriminatory in their activities. Sure, they can become discriminatory against the working class. They can deny them education. They can deny them rights. They can do lots of different things that are discriminatory. But the formation of the class is a consequence of the system that is organizing the economy, social reproduction, and all of that. Okay. So I was going to skip this. I'm not sure. I'll skip this. That's Alan Garfinkel. He's been very inspiration to me. Okay. So if we have this idea that the system is producing a working class, and I also think that this is true of gender and race as well. So the system of patriarchy produces race, and the system of white supremacy produces race and such like that. And systems of eugenics produce the group of the disabled. So there's lots of ways that we can think about different social groups and oppressed social groups in this way. And I'm not denying that there's discrimination against them, but what I'm saying is that discrimination doesn't constitute the group as such, that the system, their place in the system constitutes it. Okay, so on the view that I've talked about before, I think that, and this is what I talked about on Wednesday in more detail, that there is this public cultural techne. It's a set of norms, default assumptions, laws, policies, signaling apparatus, and such like that, that when we become socially fluent, we internalize, and it restricts what we pay attention to, what we remember, what we can talk about, how we can communicate, and all of that. And so there's a restriction here. So when we're in a society where bunnies are pets, then we interact with the bunny as a pet or as a wild animal or something like that and shape it as part of our niche to reinforce the social meaning. So the bunnies get fat and slow and they sit on our laps and things like that rather than running away. Okay, so to change social practices, we're going to change the semiotic or material conditions. And I think do I have any coming up here? So I didn't really put it in this, but last time I talked about how these practices form social relations, so a relation to a bunny or a pet, but also a relation between spouses, between lecturers and audience. You know, this practice that we're in right now is forming a relationship between us, right? And that relationship is guided by a set of norms and default assumptions. And this is a temporary relationship, you know, me speaking, but we also have a relationship of being colleagues and co-participants in this project where we each take turns doing that. And those practices have shaped our relationships to each other. And then those relations are going to be part of the skeleton of the social system. Okay, so we can try to change, like if we say, all right, no one is going to be a speaker, we're all just going to sit around in a circle the whole time and share ideas or something. That practice changes our relationship. It changes how we understand the relationship of collegiality, say. So this, in turn, could change the structures and entrenched systems formed by the practices. And on Wednesday, I talked about how a change in the semiotic conditions and the dynamics of the system could make a difference, but multiple kinds of interventions will always be necessary. So I think that the cultural and the material and the legal and all of these, you know, policies and all of those sorts of things are going to be necessary to have really transformative change. Okay, so here is, again, I talked about this on Wednesday, that we are in a social system here, and then we're embedded in an ecosystem. And so there are dynamics that affect how we interact with each other that are going to be partly dependent on the ecosystem, and then the ecosystem, you know, we affect the ecosystem and the ecosystem affects us. So we might have social to material dynamics, there are internal material dynamics, material to social dynamics, and internal social. So by the dynamics, I mean not just what is the roadmap of our relations, but how those relations are going to change, what's possible within those relations given the material conditions and the cultural technique. So I talked about that in the Wednesday lecture. Okay, so lessons, how and why do oppressive systems reproduce themselves? They're self-organizing systems that are shaped by the interaction between material conditions and culture. And so this is, what I didn't really get into in detail, is that I think that the self-organization of the system isn't just due to our rational intentions to collectively organize ourselves, because the system is maintained oftentimes by the material conditions as well. It's often maintained by the cultural technique that we don't have control over. You can't control individually, very often anyway, what the meanings of your actions are, what the meanings of the signals that we send each other are. They're not up to us. They're part of a long history of signaling and meaning and social meaning. And we can work together to change them, but my intention doesn't make it the case that, you know, what I'm doing right now is not meaningful as a professor giving a talk in an academic community, right? Even if I said, no, that's not what I mean, I'm not intending to do that, it doesn't really matter. Okay, so how does ideology critique fit into the picture? I think organic social practices, practices that we're born into, shape us as intelligible social agents. These organic ones are our mother tongue, and there are going to be all kinds of practices that you learn as you're growing up, that this constitutes you as a social subject. You learn how to greet someone, you learn how to eat with utensils that are available in your milieu. Some use chopsticks, right? And one of the early things that you do as a child is learn how to eat with those utensils. Ideology critique challenges elements of the cultural techne, claiming that they're inapt, and this I've said before too, they obscure what's valuable and or organize us unjustly. When taken up meaningfully, critique can change our practices, our structures, and the dynamics of the system. So if you think of this as not just a roadmap, but reflecting what the dynamics do, then changes here can have an influence on changes elsewhere in the system. Okay, this is going to be the most controversial. Bring it on, bring it on. So question 3, under what conditions does ideology critique provide a moral basis for transformative change? And a way to think about that question is, under what conditions does a social political structure warrant moral critique? Notice this isn't under what conditions does ideology critique cause social change, right? It's not it's because, you know, you can critique society and it have no effect whatsoever and it still be a warranted critique. So at this stage, we're just worried about what warrants the critique. To answer, I think we should ask, what morally justifies a social political structure in the first place, right? Because if you're going to say what warrants your critique of it, well, why does anyone think that this is a good one in the first place? So I think that what justifies a social political structure is that it enables us to coordinate effectively to maintain or increase our individual and collective well-being, especially in light of problems that arise from our conflicting interests. So the presupposition here is that we need to coordinate. There's not any, you can't survive, infants die if there isn't someone taking care of them, right? There's no option but to coordinate with each other and providing for each other in terms of, food, shelter, protection, love, and if babies aren't loved, they will die, right? This is a kind of core idea. So we want our individual and collective well-being through coordination. The coordination scheme serves its purpose insofar as it benefits us all equally. This is because when we're going to coordinate, what we're doing is we're entering into a process of mutual support in getting along with each other, right? This is what justifies it. If it doesn't do that, then we could say it's unjustified. I don't have reason to join it if I'm just going to be abused, right, in that system. So it serves its purpose, which of mutual coordination for the benefit of all. If it benefits us equally, so it should include ways to protect the individuals within it from harm and abuse. Abuse of individuals includes bodily and psychic harm, getting less than their fair share, being exploited or dominated, and harm includes misfortunes not caused by agents. So I think that if a hurricane hits and people are injured, it's still, a bad thing. And so it's part of the coordination scheme, the purpose of the coordination scheme to protect individuals from harm and abuse. And so we need to enter into the situation to improve their conditions. An effective coordination scheme should also have ways to maintain itself, to keep it going over time, and to protect itself from those who aim to undermine it. To avoid the abuse of the system and of individuals within it, the scheme should involve active participation of all in the process of self-maintenance. And this, I think, is something that Gianfranco was talking about yesterday. I think it's not to say that in every decision everybody has to be involved. That is unrealistic. But there's going to have to be active participation of, all people in some form or other in the context of maintaining the system. So given that some pretty clear bases for critique, if this is what systems or social systems are supposed to do, the system is not benefiting us equally, it's not protecting us from abuse, it's allowing some members to undermine it, perhaps by excluding full participation in its development and maintenance. This, of course, raises epistemic questions. Who are the we? What are the relevant benefits, and who decides whether they're distributed equally? What counts as abuse? And when is an effective system being undermined, and when is it being approved? I think these are epistemic questions. I think they're separate from the questions of what warrants a system to exist, what makes it legitimate. I think that we can't answer these questions in any obvious way. This is going to be, we're going to be fallible about this. We're going to have controversies about this. And so we need a process in the system to resolve our disagreements about these problems. So, on my view, a social system should protect and enhance the capabilities of its members to thrive. The members include not only humans, but other living things in the environment. This is, in a sense, a kind of normative naturalism, not a form of rationalism. So I include naturalism in scare quotes because I think humans are part of the natural world. I think the social world is part of the natural world. There is this interdependence between, we are animals. We're animals, and we live in a social world, but that social world is part of a natural world. And so, as I said on Wednesday, I think that when we're thinking about human nature, that we have to see ourselves as essentially social beings, and our social beings, we have the power to change our nature. We have the power to evolve in response to our own interventions in the world. Humans can only fully thrive within a social context when they collectively develop and exercise new capabilities over time. So the relevant capabilities should be those that can be exercised and developed within an effective system of coordination. They should not include the capability to harm or exploit others. So we have the capability to do great harm, and we have the capability to do, unjust and wrongful things. But when we're talking about what enables us to fully thrive, we should not encourage this capability to be developed because we need and depend on a system to support us. In effect, a warranted system of coordination involves sustainable co-creation that builds on and extends the capacities of living things. There is no template for doing this. We have to figure it out in particular historical contexts collectively. This is the processualism that Rahel and I agree on. So we are evolving beings, and the thing that's distinctive about us is that we have a direct effect on our own social and biological evolution. We can make ourselves evolve in certain ways. And it's going to be very difficult to know, what fulfills human needs at one point in history or in one point in culture won't necessarily be what fulfills human needs at another point and another time in culture, because we are these historical beings. Nevertheless, we can together assess when capabilities are being diminished or destroyed. So this is the epistemic question. When are they being diminished or destroyed? That's something that isn't going to be obvious. There's going to be contestation. But we can together assess this. And the political questions, which I haven't gotten into, is what are the mechanisms of assessment? What are the political institutions that support that assessment? How can we guarantee that? So is democracy? I haven't said democracy is. Democracy might be, it might not be. There might be, and it might be in some contexts, but not in other contexts. So I'm not getting into the political question about how we deal with disagreement. I'm not getting into the epistemic question about how we can know these things. We can talk about that, but I think that they're the sorts of things that we can only know collectively by sorting it through ourselves together. And so if we do that, we can make warranted demands based on the assessment, and this grounds ideology critique.
Yeah, thank you so much. As I already said on Wednesday, Sally and I have been in such a fruitful and productive exchange, for years now, that I don't know, and in some ways she's my favorite sparring partner with respect to some of those topics. And I really couldn't think of an encounter that would have inspired me more in those last couple of weeks, I would say. And I think we both are, it's not only that we share a lot of intuitions here and share, a certain goal, namely to criticize and to change the world, but also the idea that one should do, I mean, in philosophy, that one should also do this by bridging some gaps that are not so productive. So Sally, for me, is one of the rare persons of whom I think, or an example for trying to become bilingual in philosophy. And this is what it should do. I mean, at least being bilingual in terms of not being stuck in just one tradition and one set of concepts and so on and so on. But this also means that there's always a lot of need to explain to each other. Where do you come from? Why do you react to certain theses and positions in such a way? What is that triggers you here and so on? So this is, but again, I mean, this is what makes it productive, that one has to explain a lot. So yeah, being my favorite sparring partner in today, I'm actually not as, I really want to ask some questions of clarification. I don't think that I'm also, probably I won't get to the ideology critique part, because as I said, just stop me after 10 minutes. I have so many questions that I can just, I don't know, after a while I can just stop. So the first question concerns the associationist model of society here. I mean, and this is really, a question that would ask you to elaborate a bit more on this, because I wasn't sure. You say such associations aren't just a set of individuals, but made up of individuals who in some sense share intentions, and you explained a little bit what you mean by this. I'm still not so sure how, let's say, individualistic or holistic this account is. So does it mean that individuals already have intentions and then come together and share them and go for some common goal, or would you go into the, let's say, more holistic direction of, okay, so even let's say the material out of which we our own intentions are made or formed is already social. So then social would be first, and the individual intention and even individual interests would emerge out of this already shared common ground. And I would think that some of your theoretical tools with respect to cultural technique and your practice account and so on would move you a bit further in this, let's say, holistic or moderate holistic direction, but sometimes it and some of the positions that are that people defend in this huge debate on social ontology, some of those who would say, yeah, shared intentions are remaining within the individualistic framework, and that's something I just want to know how far you would go, or how you see this. Second question with respect to the intentions here, shared intentions. Is it always intentions that are shared? Because again, your practice account seems to, and a lot of what you said in the discussions during the last days, seems to, you seem to defend a position where intentions are not the only and not the main thing. So this practice idea that sometimes we start from the practices work their way into our intentions, not always the other way around. So this is something that I would be interested in, whether the shared intentions account here is in some tension with the practice account that would start with habits, start with the cultural technique idea is something where, when you explained how we become fluent in the cultural technique, then, and you explained it very vividly on on Wednesday, like, for some reasons you would not even, get the idea that you would sit down at the panel, and this is something that is not like intentional but habitual, and something that is structured differently. So is it always so what does it mean to share intentions? Is it a slightly individualistic or slightly holistic account? And then is it always intentions? Is it not also so that we somehow are trained into into some kind of embodied and lived habits. Second part of it, so this is still the first question I warned you about the association in this model of society. So second part, what do you mean by association here? What kind of relation is the association that you have in mind? Is it an association, a relation between more or less strangers, or is it something that already implies a communal or ethical life? So the shared intentions approach, again, does it mean that we already agree upon how we live together, how we cooperate, and so on? So basically the question is, coming from sociology and social theory here is there any difference between what in sociology is called Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, so community or society as a relation that is not only looser but sometimes based on contract, but basically a relation where strangers try to coordinate their behavior but do not intend to live together. So what kind of relation is implied in the model of the associational model of society? Then one step further, what specifies an association? What kind of association? Is society then something like an association of associations, as Durkheim would say? And if so, what specifies those associations? Is it just like, we have a plurality, we have a lot of different neighborhoods and they somehow relate to each other, or is there some kind of social division of labor at play where this association would be, like in Hegel's system of cooperation, where those would form some kind of unity because they belong together in this kind of, let's say, rather organicist model where a society is made up of association that have a specific task, that work together, that need each other because only together they can fulfill the task of social reproduction as such. So is there, how do they hang together? And is it this kind of functional, meaningful functional kind of being connected to each other and being dependent on each other, or is it just, let's say, a model where those associations just add up? So, as a matter of fact, we have a lot of them, but as a social theorist, you don't have to, or do not yet have an explanation of how they hang together in this kind of. So, yeah. Do they have tasks? Is there division of labor between the associations? What kind of model would you prefer with respect to how the associations that together make up social order in the society hang together? Second part. Sabine, how am I doing?
3 minutes left.
Oh, okay. Okay, I had 7 questions. But I'm raising them. We have enough.
Afterwards,
yeah. So second part, again, on the system thing here. Because you introduced the idea of a system, and as I take it, what you say, the basic model is we have practices, we have structures. Structures are networks of relations. They consist of places and relations, notches and edges, and then there is somehow this network. The structures, as you said, form the skeleton of the complex dynamic system. Mm-hmm. And then system comes in, and system is seen as something that maintains itself and has this kind of homeostasis without central authority and so on. And this makes me a bit uneasy, or I just don't know how and why you need it, why you need to introduce the concept of a system here, and what kind of, again, speaking in terms of social theory, what kind of system theory is at stake here? And I just want to understand a bit better why you do it. As far as I understand, you need it because you want to explain that it's not just stable social structures, but a dynamic. And this is what you call, or the dynamics is what you try to conceive of in terms of a system. But I'm not sure whether this is not, again, in some kind of tension with your practice theoretical approach and with your idea of social structures here. Because it has a... So why do you need systems here? First thing is you need it in order to explain the dynamics, in order to make this, I mean, the picture that you had on Wednesday, to make this like move. And then, no. And then a second reason, and this is also the reason why Habermas brought in system into his social theory. The second thing is that, as a matter of fact, societies are such, and most of our modern societies, that things happen behind our backs. That it's not just, I mean, intentional action. We coordinate and we know what we do and we agree upon certain things, but there are some parts of our social structure, our social life, in which at least the impression that things have a life of its own and go on behind our backs, but even in a successful way. That, like, I mean, everyone celebrates then the market as a coordination mechanism that functions in a different way. And so my suggestion would be, to stay within the 10 minutes, my suggestion would be to replace this by practice theory all the way down, and to remain with practices, social structures. With the practice account, you already have the idea that it is not just about intentions, that it's not always like, like a contract model of cooperation and coordination, that things go on behind our backs, that there are unintended consequences of our own actions, that what we do has an effect on a whole web of actions. Also that practices are patterns that make us act and at the same time are produced by us. So this whole, I mean, ongoing question and riddle, like how does it come about that in some way this world is made, I mean, our social world is made by us, but it doesn't seem so, and some of it is inevitable, some of it is bad, I mean, a bad form of alienation or reification, but also, I mean, in order to have a realistic account of social life, one has to admit that it's not, I mean, that the idea of a completely rational control about all of our social activities is an illusion. So, but I do think that you can get hold of this in terms of, because the practice, I mean, this basis module of a practice is already, gives tribute to this. And again, I mean, just some last sentences, and because I said one always has to explain where do I come from, why do I react to your to the system idea here, and the way you introduce it, a bit allergic. And this, of course, within critical theory has a lot to do with the fact that Habermas at some point introduced his dual social theory, where he would talk about system on the one hand, life world on the other, and with the, I mean, it has been heavily criticized from, I mean, quite a lot of Habermas critics, but somehow no one actually came up with a real alternative, I would say, or at least this is one of those discussions that are somehow in the air but not really taken up anymore. And I do think that it has produced really bad consequences, namely in case of Habermas, the consequence that the economy has been seen as a system, meaning that so here we shouldn't interfere. In some sense, the economy does better, and this is somehow buying into mainstream economics, I would say, does better if we just leave it alone. The problem then comes in, and this is why he has this dual approach and doesn't go for system theory all the way down. The problem comes in when the economy, the system, cannibalizes, colonizes the life world. And I do think that this is not a productive way to think about it. And this is why I'm a bit concerned about it. Not only because I think in your case it's not yet clear how the system and the way that systems change. I mean, this has a lot of consequences for the question of social change. Because if you conceive of systems as self-maintaining and self-organizing, then you will have this level of change through like systemic adaptation, evolution, and so on. And then on the other side, the level where social agents want to change and interfere in the system, and you want both. And yeah, so on a very, I mean, on a conceptual level, I don't see how this works. And then, as I said, I mean, my concerns are with this kind of, once you introduce system here, you are into trouble. Okay, so I skip the rest. Thank you.
Want me to respond to them separately or all at once?
What do you prefer? It's up to you.
Well, I think I could at least say some things right off, and then I think I could say a few things briefly, and then maybe we could have a general discussion sort of about some of the themes that come up. Is that okay? Okay. So thank you, Rahel. That was really helpful. So I think I was perhaps not clear enough. I don't embrace an associationist model of society. I think that associations are part of what goes on when we cooperate. So if we want to take a walk together and we decide to take a walk, we have shared intentions. If we want to decide how to organize ourselves to produce a workshop, you know, it's associationist, we're cooperating. There's a lot of cooperative activity, but part of what I was trying to suggest is that associationism doesn't really capture social formation, because social formation happens without our intentions often. It happens because there are processes that are pushing us. So I really sympathize with your concerns about associationism. I do think that in the analytic social ontology literature, there are a lot of people who think it's intentions first, and then we come together and we share them and we influence each other's attentions. And I think that is so atomistic and so wrong. And I agree with you completely that our intentions are shaped by the possibility of our practices and our living together and all of that. So I completely agree with that. And I like to start from practices because I think that, you know, we may be human bodies prior to being in social practices, but we're not social agents until we take up social practices and are influenced by social practices. So yes, yes. In terms of what is an association, I think that what I'd be inclined to say about that level of society is that there's both kinds. There's some associations that are between strangers. So, for example, Ayanna Pressley is my representative in Congress of the United States. Well, I've never met Ayanna Pressley. I've never met the other constituents of Ayanna Pressley. Well, I've met some because they're my neighbors, because it's geographical. But it's very, very much not a life world that we're talking about. But in my neighborhood, I think that we do have something more intimate than that, and it's more of a community, and we support each other and help each other and shovel each other's sidewalks when the snow falls and such like that. So I do want to say that there are both kinds, and it's really helpful to emphasize that I should be distinguishing them more clearly. I do think that associations and social formations are co-integrated. So there's going to be, you know, there's an association of people who are, say, the constituents of Ayanna Pressley, and then that is connected to the constituents of someone else who's a representative, you know, because there's someone else representing another town, whatever. And so there are these influences. So from the Massachusetts senators influence the congressional representatives. So there's going to be structural and institutional connections between the associations, but they're also going to be more implicit and unobvious associations between, you know, I live in an area called Central Square. There's a Central Square Business Association. That association decides a lot of things about what happens in the stores that are in Central Square and all of those sorts of things. And they affect our neighborhood, and the neighborhood affects what's there. So there's going to be co-integration, I think, at a less, you know, explicit institutional way. Okay, systems. I think that what's tricky here is, I think that practices are at the base of everything. So I think that You and I are engaging in a practice right now that sets us up in a relationship. That relationship is part of a network of relationships we have with other colleagues, and that's a network that has, resilience and has its own dynamics, because here we are, we're in a networked relationship right here. And this networked relationship has the potential to change how critical theory gets done in Europe, how critical theory gets done in the US, how critical theory gets done in Latin America, because this network is made up of us in this practice together and our relationships to each other. But when I'm trying to talk about a system, what I have in mind is that network is going to be affected by the fact that we live quite far from each other. And so there's a material constraint. We can't see each other as much as we would like, say, face to face. We can't have these events all the time. So there's economic constraints on this relationship and the physical constraints on the relationship. There are language constraints on these relationships. So that would be part of the cultural techne. So this network, the shape and the flow of this network is influenced by these dynamics that have to do with the material world, that have to do with the economic constraints, that have to do with language constraints and all of that. And so what it's able to do in terms of its influence and how that is going to affect other institutions that we're part of is going to be affected by these dynamics that influence our relationship. Now we can also, this network can be co-integrated with networks. So I'm very networked in the feminist community in the United States. So I can, there can be because I'm gonna take things I've learned here back there, and then they're gonna learn it and then teach me things that I might be able to be bringing back here. So when I'm talking about systems, I'm just talking about that. I'm talking about the ways in which networks that are created through practices have dynamics that we don't control. Like we don't control how far away Boston is from Lima or how much it costs to fly to Lima. And that's not part, I wish I could control more my ability to speak Spanish, but I don't have much control over that, right? So at this point in my life, it's very hard for, so there are things that are affecting our relationships that aren't part of our shared intentions. I would love to speak Spanish. I would love to be able to have all of this happening in Spanish and me understand it. I really would. But that cultural techne is not available to me. And so that's going to affect how much I can be involved, et cetera, like that. So I don't know if that makes sense, but so I don't think it's a separate thing, the system, and then we are something else. I think that systems are us, is what I want to say.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great honor to be here and to read you and to discuss with you. And it also has been quite challenging. And I will start also with the difference between structure and system that just came up, because I had a lot of doubts about it that you are not resolved with what you said at the end. So I will stick to my script because I saw the 10 minutes are very, very short. And I start by saying that I read your article, Systemic and Structural Injustice. Is there a difference to guide my reading? And so that there is a difference, you already imply in the title, and the interest you really take in this difference becomes clear when you quote Martin Luther King at the beginning of this paper. So it's because it helps us to understand the system of white supremacy. This is what you say, a system that produces murderers. You use King's words here. So this is, like, for me, it was striking. Like, made clear what is your interest really in this difference between systemic and structural injustice. So you ask how this system recruits perpetrators in order to enact it, and you claim that the differentiation between structures and systems is a way to understand better how this works and how individuals willingly or unwillingly act out roles that follow certain social logics and that eventually can kill. So to point out that the difference between systemic and structural is not the one between material and the ideal realm is like step one in your argument, and until here I fully agree with you, because of course structures have an impact, and of course structures have effects that constitute reality. And I liked very much your chess analogy, and let me quote you, consider the rook in chess. It can be any random object, but its status as rook is defined by a set of permissible move relationships. So it's really a wonderful image that also could have been drawn by Kafka or someone like that. And this is maybe because I liked it so much, because it's an image that helps us to think through the way the individuals find themselves in a position that leave them a restricted number of moves that are allowed. And this brings me to the two fields of problems I want to bring up. Both have to do with ideology critique. And the first one, it could be maybe, if we want to title it, it could be about conceptual differentiations and the role they play and the position they have in the critique of ideology. And I also did some homework, and I read that because in this paper you engage with Robin Chelikates and his paper on epistemic injustice. And there I read that your approach has been described as lacking complexity. And it was not clear to me how he meant that, because if we understand complexity as differentiation, then if something your thought is not lacking, it's differentiation. And it's really, this is a compliment. I find it very fascinating, like the meticulousness with you have to pin down the definitions of the concepts you use. But I have to confess that it's also somehow uncanny to me, and I was asking myself why I felt this the unease with this differentiation, and I got to the it's a very vague intuition, but I got to the conclusion that maybe what triggers this unease is the similarity with administrative knowledge and logistics that I find in this pinning down all the category in the differentiations. So if I would have to put it into a question, I would ask if this attempt of differentiation doesn't bear the danger of reifying and freezing the reality in this moment that you are taking the snapshot, so to say. And does it not also bear the danger of registering only the given side of reality? It registers what there is. So what I mean by this is that descriptive knowledge and denotative language always runs the risk of becoming somewhat tautological. But what's more important, and you also focused on it in your talk now, that when it comes to the possibilities of change, you focus on cultural techniques, if I may, that should be changed if they're unjust or produce unjust positions. And here I want to recall a warning that Adorno announced regarding something that he called the technological veil, that is the danger that a critique of society is sometimes blinded by focusing on the technological side. So let me quote Adorno, that the forces of production and the relations of production would be one nowadays, and that one could immediately construe society from the standpoint of the productive forces alone, is the current form of socially necessary appearance. So this is would be a form of ideology. And to make clear what I mean here is that I see that you are talking about relations and about techniques, and I don't see exactly how they are articulated. So especially in this cooperation model of society, and the fear is that the relation side is a bit unproblematic, and the technology is being foregrounded. And now my last field of problem that I want to open up, if I have still the time, concerns the concept of vulnerability as a tool for ideology critique. So your approach captures the ways in which the structural conditions for agency distribute power, and sticking to the example given at the beginning, you ask how racial hierarchies produce oppression and how this oppression becomes systemic when reproduced. So the positionalities or the nodes in this structure you describe the following way, and I quote you, so I won't lose anything there. A white person in the United States can avoid certain positional vulnerabilities. This is a form of privilege, and yeah, there's no doubt that all of this is true. But I was asking myself how this might help us to answer the question posed at the beginning. So how does it help us to answer the question how the system produces murderers? So I think that from the point of view of positionality or of vulnerability or of privilege, then you would have to think the vulnerability of white supremacists. And we know that now in Austria the fascist party had a huge election success, and we all know that it's underprivileged people that tend to mend their narcissistic wounds by engaging with this kind of supremacist and fascist ideas. So I understand that this is not the kind of analysis you aim towards, but for me this would be like the necessary consequence of operating with the category of vulnerability, and then to that you have this bigger like it's you just problematized it in your talk as well. There's an interesting treatment of vulnerability also when you say that capitalism is a system where vulnerability is exploited to produce an oppressed group. So you talk about, and this is remarkable, the vulnerability of the workers, and on the one hand, the necessity to work for wage you consider already a vulnerability, and this is something I want to applaud on the one hand, and then I was still reading further because of course the vulnerability is the need to sell their labor, and this restricts their choices. And then when I was reading your definition of group as individuals sharing a particular node, it came up now several times, in a set of relations, you say that a group will be oppressed, and I quote you, if the relevant structure of social relations is wrongful and unjust. So if, for example, the worker is not paid a fair wage, or if the conditions of work are unacceptable, end of quote. But you also say that the oppressed group of workers is produced by the system, and I don't quite understand how all this comes together. Is not wherever exploitation takes place and injustice happening, and is there really a fair wage, or isn't it that something unjust wherever capital appropriates someone's lifetime, work time, in order to appropriate surplus value? So yeah, wouldn't it be wrongful and unjust to produce individuals who have to sell their work and their lifetime and to come to an end? That's the last sentence. When you ask yourself at the end of the paper, if there can be a structural injustice without systemic injustice, I'm tempted to push in the opposite direction and ask if there can be an unjust system without structural injustice.
Would you like to answer right now, or what do you prefer, Sally?
How much time do we have? I mean, where are we
We're
in
still
the...
fine. It's just 1 hour that we spend together from now on. So we have got more time.
So-
You can answer.
Why don't I answer and then if there are themes that I want to pick up on,
That's
we do
perfect.
that and then go on. Is that okay? Thank you. Thank you so much, Stephanie, for engaging it so thoughtfully, especially when it was kind of foreign and alienating to you. I really appreciate that, and I understand that experience, I should say. Not, anyway, it doesn't matter, but thank you for you. I think you have a very good sense of what I'm trying to do, and I think that maybe it would help when we're talking about this kind of administrative sort of frame and the techniques for me to say just a little bit about how I think that practices work. So when I think of the techne, I think of it as just a set of tools, some of which might have know-how involved in them, but they're tools that we rely on when there's a signaling. So the way I think of it is when someone sees a person with very dark skin and very curly hair, that signals and triggers a kind of responsiveness, because just the way when someone uses a word, lots of things happen, you think things, you feel things, whatever. So it's a full body kind of, it can be a kind of full body experience. And so if a Black person enters a space where that appearance is signaling, it's signaling something to that community given their techne, then there may be hostility that is triggered, it may be welcome that's triggered, it may be all different kinds of responsiveness that's, you know, you may open your body to them and say, so great to see you, or you may, you know, be terrified, but that's going to be kind of how that appearance is situated as a signal within that community. So then I think it's, that techne is so often what is going to be crucial in then shaping the practice of what happens. So the people in that community, their practice is to exclude Black people, or their practice is to open to Black people. And so there will be a practice, and then how you do it. Do you bow to them? Do you namaste? You know, do you shake their hand? And how that is going to be the relevant practice that you start to engage in once that trigger. And I think it happens, you know, with women too. A person comes in and presents as a woman, and there's a whole range of practices that then get triggered in response to that. And then that triggers also different, so, you know, notice when a woman or a Black person or, you know, whatever, walk in the room, or a disabled person, there's so many things you don't notice about them because you've been shaped to just notice this first, above all else, because those signals are going to be the signals that when you're socially fluent, you have to be most responsive to. So if you're in a community that's very racist and you don't respond to those signals that are telling you how to behave with the practices that you do, you're going to be an outlier and you're going to look weird, and people are going to start going, what are you doing? You know, we don't treat people that way, or whatever like that. So I do think that what I'm trying to get at is the ways in which our practices rely on this signaling process, and then that triggers practices that bring with it whole body responses, emotional responses and stuff. And I'm not sure that that's responsive to the administrative state problem, but I was thinking that when it was, you know, just a rule or a technique that was in the cultural techne, where we were trying to analyze the particular rule, which seems kind of administrative, it does seem very sterile, and it's hard to imagine that someone would become a murderer if it's just a rule. But if it's this broad response to this as a kind of being in the world that is a threat to me, because that's in the techne, people like that are a threat to me, then I might, become violent in response to them. Or the standard example in the US is that women who are walking along the sidewalk and encounter a black man, they clutch their purse and cross the street, But it's just the trigger. It's just that what they saw, the only thing they could see is male, black. That was all they saw. They didn't see anything else. And then that triggers this practice of crossing the street. I don't know. So I'm not sure that response is adequate, so tell me if it's not responsive.
I think there's a slide.
Okay, I'm sorry. Well, we can come back to it, maybe? Okay. I also love this idea of freezing reality, and I think that that's an issue, and what I'm trying to include, but I haven't given good examples of, about how the dynamics actually work so it doesn't freeze. But I think it's a risk, and I think it's a danger, and I appreciate that. I really like the issue of vulnerability and the question about, fair wage. A fair wage is not good enough, and I agree with that. We should be moving to a place where there isn't socially necessary labor. It was a way of trying to think about, in ways that were familiar, what it would mean if the system was not structured in a traditionally unjust way and making it a traditionally more just way. But I agree with you about that. I think looking more at vulnerability and the ways in which vulnerability triggers the capacity of being a murderer and such like that, I need to incorporate that much more, and I appreciate that thought.
Yeah, thank you very much. Of course, I would like to thank the organization and Sally for the opportunity to discuss with her. And a lot of things have been said, so I feel a little bit. So I will improvise a bit, based on a little bit on the answers that you have been given. And I'm a little bit insecure about my questions, but anyways. So my first question concerns your understanding of ideology as cultural technique. And I remember reading from your texts from this comparison that you make to language. You say, well, a cultural technique is like a language. No? We talk within language. Maybe we could say that language doesn't talk through us. No, we talk through language. Language restricts our possibilities of what we can say, what we cannot say, etc., etc. No? So does ideology do, no? And I was wondering, and you use the word techne, no? Instrument. And I was wondering if maybe there is a more, let's say, and from what I heard, maybe that's also what you actually mean, a more radical understanding of what ideology does, in the sense that ideology desires through us, no? Let's say, it's not only that it restricts my possibilities, it's not only that it's the backdrop of what I wish or what I believe, but it's actually giving me productively the content of my belief. And okay, so you agree with that. You agree with that. So okay, so maybe I didn't understand it. Okay.
I'd say more.
Okay.
I think this,
yeah.
But maybe I don't have a good way
Okay.
to articulate that yet.
All right.
So help me
Yeah.
articulate.
no, articulation. Yeah. So so now, for example, saying like, who's my type? No, the ideology is telling me who I should desire. No, ideology is telling me what I want to buy, etc., etc. It's not only that it's restricting the possibilities.
It's kind of a
Yes, it's productive. Yeah, yeah. Okay, okay, perfect. Because I was wondering about this, because sometimes you use the expression restriction, backdrop, and I was wondering about this. But from what you were saying, then I understood that it made more sense to think it more productive sense. Of course, this creates a lot of problems if you think it like that, because it's like, where is free agency and so on. And here, it's just an idea, because it came to my mind this whole readings of Cornelius Castoriadis, who thinks something like, we are made of our alterity. So our alterity constitutes us, something that is not us constitutes us. No? Our unconscious, our, let's say, ideology constitutes us. No? And the only thing we can aspire to is to adopt a more reflexive and critical, let's say, view toward what is already us, what we desire, what we tend to desire, or what we tend to believe. So yeah, I was wondering about what you think about this. Yeah, this is the first question. You let me know when then this whole question about systems, and well, I was also wondering about this, and I had a question. I don't know if it's interesting, but so when you talk about systems, I was wondering if when we have to struggle against injustice, we have to think of new ways of organizing, etc., etc. We also should integrate the idea within our idea of justice, let's say, that we should have less rigid systems or something like this. So organize society in a way that it can be better controlled, not necessarily from a central system, but experimentally, democratically, you name it, decentralized and so on. But so when we think about just institutions, just practices, we think of them as also about the need for them to be steerable. Steerable? Is that a word? Yeah. Yeah. Which would make like some systems more controllable and other systems less controllable. And then maybe that's a way of. But I think you were implying something like that in your answer. Okay, so these are two questions. Then I have another question that concerns the way you understand consciousness rising as a critical practice, etc. Because for me it was amazing when I read your text. Now I'm going to talk about me for a second, but in my dissertation, I actually have this chapter on consciousness rising as a process of inquiry, and I was astonished to see that there were many, many common aspects. Of course, this has a Debian, there is a Debian background here. And from this Debian background, I would like to ask you this following question that I think maybe you will also agree. Not only Debian, but also Freire, from Paulo Freire. Because Freire has this whole idea that consciousness rising is possible in practices where we deal with something as a material for transformation. It's not only that we communicate, it's not only, for example, of course, it's very important to have, like, let's say, more immediately communicative practices, such as the ones that Freire describes, like we share experiences, etc., etc. But there's also something about, like, the materiality, of consciousness, that is also very important for consciousness rising. And I was wondering what you have to say about this. I'm sure you have a lot of things to say, but then I would like to push you on that. I don't know, for example, you think about like common gardening, even like dancing, theater, you name it, Because in a way, for example, what Freire does is to show that literacy courses, so learning to write in certain communities, was also a way of consciousness rising, It makes salient different knowledges that are not salient in other contexts, for example. This is one of the. So yeah, so I was wondering about this, and I don't know if I have. Yeah, just one last brief question. I was wondering how it relates how your view on ideology relates to habitus, to Bordian habitus. Yeah, so I just can give an example. I experienced that a few days ago here. There was somebody from the service, and it's a person that I've been seeing for a few days. And I made a joke the first day, and this person has been kept laughing about that joke every day. And this repetition, I think you can take it as a part of her habitus. No, I mean, making always about the same joke and again, and ha ha ha, and you know. And I was wondering, is this ideology or what is this? Because in a way, what she does puts her in the structure, and I can identify her as member of a certain, no. So in a way, she contributes to her own positioning, no. So to the reproduction of the structure, but at the same time, it's difficult to call it ideology. So I was wondering about what you think about this. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Great questions. Really, really fun to think about. So, so I do think that that cultural techne and ideology are productive and not just restrictive. And I think I'm a little uncertain because I often talk about structures, and this is connected to the Rook example, create a choice architecture for us. And that choice architecture, so we have choice, so I'm trying to emphasize that we're free agents in some sense of free agents because we have a choice architecture that is shaped by, so for example, you know, if I'm a woman, there are certain clothes that are going to fit me and certain clothes that are going to be suitable, you know, for me to wear, but I get to choose what to wear. I mean, it's not like, you know, the society is telling me I have to wear this shirt, right? You know, something like that. So there are choices that I have within a choice architecture, but what happens is that what happens is that people come to identify with certain ways of occupying that choice architecture. So it's not just a choice. They come to see that this is necessary for them to be who they are, right? And so I want to sometimes say that that's how it becomes productive, but I think it's still missing something. And I'm not quite sure. So what I want to do is say, yes, I want it to be productive because I think that part of what ideology does, so suppose I am conforming to feminine clothing norms just because I know that that's going to be good for me, right? And I don't identify with it, it's just instrumental. Then I think that the ideology hasn't been productive. It's just me, I'm living within constraint. But then there comes to be a point where I start to see myself as beautiful and myself in these sorts of ways, only if I'm wearing certain kinds of clothing, which I think we all do. I mean, we all choose kinds of clothing because it feels like us, right? It feels like that expressive possibility of our appearance is really important. And so then it becomes more productive because then wearing this becomes part of who I am. And then to be deprived of that is to be deprived of something fundamental to me. And being told, you know, for a woman who wears a veil or a hijab, that she can't wear it. I mean, it's not just a constraint on her in some kind. It's like a violation of her as a person, right? So, but I'm not sure that this gets fully at the productive part of it. So I'm thank you for the nudge to think more about that. So Castoriadis, I don't really know the work well. It's on a reading list that I've had for a long time, along with Luhmann. But I have tried to read Luhmann. I really have, and it's like, oh God, help! You know, I can't do that. So a reflexive approach to the productive desire. Yes, I think that this is connected to the consciousness raising issue, because what happens is that you're in a community, say, where you're trying to do something together and this damn skirt is getting in your way, or, you know, whatever, and then you all notice, like, let's just take our skirts off, or, you know, whatever you're going to do. So there's a kind of materiality that is often the prompt for consciousness raising, because there's this negation. We were talking in the cab last night, the kind of desiring negation. I can't stand having to just, be constrained by this clothing or that clothing or things like that. I mean, that's a trivial, I use a lot of kind of trivial examples because they seem familiar, and I don't mean it all to be that trivial, but I do think it's kind of important that these kinds of self-presentation. So you kind of, you're chafing against, you're resisting a particular material constraint on you, but you see that you're not the only one. And so there comes to be the possibility of, though it doesn't always happen, of a kind of shared construction of a critique and the start of a new practice. So that's where I think that consciousness raising happens, is where your resistance becomes collective and you begin to form a new practice. Because if you do it by yourself, typically you're going to be punished, and you'll be punished in a collective too, but it's not as impossible to manage if the resistance is to you as a collective. So I do believe that my own views, there are many different kinds of consciousness raising, and it will depend, but the materiality of it is very important to me also, and also in the development of a new practice, because I think that's where we've really gotten past just, we don't like it this way. It's like experimenting with new ways of doing it that is going to be dealing with the resources in new ways. And for me, resources aren't always material. Resources could be time, they could be knowledge, they could be things like that. So materiality becomes a little bit abstract sometimes like that. Okay. Okay, one last thing. I know, I love the steerable. I'm gonna start thinking about that. So just thank you, that's a gift. Like, you all are giving me gifts here, and I take that as a gift, the steerability. And lastly, a habitus. So a habitus in Bourdieu, I think of as a set of dispositions. So I think of it as the dispositions that you develop when you become fluent in a social practice, or that when you're trying to change it, the ones that you recreate those dispositions. Where I think of the cultural techne as more, it's not in our heads. So dispositions are dispositions that I carry individually with me. And we can have similar dispositions, but I think of the techne as, so, I'm sorry, this is a bit Althusserian, but when the priest holds up the host, that is the apparatus. It's a material thing in the world that's part of the techne. It's an apparatus to signal something to you. And then you'll have a set of dispositions to respond to it if you're fluent in that techne. But the world, Althusser says, ideology is material. And I'm with Althusser on this. It's the signal that is out there that carries those meanings, whether they're in my head or not, right? So I can resist the ideology and still be influenced by it and whatever, but it is there, public, out there, carried in objects. And this is hard because this is kind of an analytic philosophy sort of thing about meanings, what meanings are. And I think meanings aren't in the head, sorry. And so social meanings aren't in the head either. So, but I don't want to get into that because that will take us down a road that will seem really obscure and probably not worth it. So thank you very much, thank you.
Yeah, thank you to all of you. Now we have at least a half an hour for questions, and I would like to open the floor to the public. Maybe 2 questions, and then maybe you can respond, or the 3 of you also can respond.
Yeah, please, everybody jump in.
Thank you, Sally. I have only one question, and it is, have you thought of how education can help? This only. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you. It is very good to see the dialogue between critical Western philosophy and analytical philosophy. I will try to be nice, or not.
Okay, I like that.
Or I will try to be nice with the critics. Now I'm joking, but I was hoping and expecting to see more about systemic change, structural change, social change and more focus on that topic, because it's like I agree with something that Jaeggi said, like maybe you need or maybe you should tell us more about your account on conflict, or your account on this, like to say in the honest word, like fight for recognition, like this account of conflicts that there are within the system. Because let's say, like this year I started to study social ontology, so I don't know very much, but like Osa Burman book on non-ideal social ontology, like you have ideal social ontology that would be associationist model, that is like, oh, we are all together, this is a harmonious society, we just cooperate. You are in disagreement with that view. You are more in a non-ideal social ontology, like there are conflicts, there are people fighting, etc. But you might need like to account for social change, structural change, systemic change. You might need like a more emancipatory, non-ideal social ontology, like how to account for conflict, like how do systems change, like how do structures might change if we take on practices that can change, we fight for some recognition of rights. How is your account of that? Like I would like to listen to you more about that topic.
Thank you. Thank you so much for both questions. So on education, yes, I have a grad student who's doing a critical theory of education, and she's amazing, and I do think it can make a big difference. I think that part of what she's interested in is how do you educate kids and adults so that they have a greater capacity for self-reflexivity and for social critique, and how they could engage with each other. I think some of it is also having to do with the materiality of things. So I work some with engineers at MIT, and they have a lot of difficulty. They learn all of the math and science, and then, but when they get into the field, they don't know how to relate to people and sort of understand the needs of the people, and then how to design something that's going to meet the real needs of the people, because they have this template of what they're supposed to do. So, you know, getting into the material conditions of people's lives and partnering with people to understand what's going to meet their needs. I mean, those sorts of things. So even at MIT education, I think is very flawed, because it doesn't open up new horizons of possibility for what could be designed for what purpose. It's just like, we're gonna apply our algorithms and our calculations, and we're gonna give this to you, and you're gonna like it, you know, some sort of thing like that. And so I think there could be quite a bit more emancipatory educational practices that we should be instituting from, you know, Rahel was talking about kindergarten all the way up to, you know, adult education. Yes. So on the issue of conflict, so I think that there are different kinds of conflict. Some of the conflict is going to be in the political domain, when you want to change a law or change a policy, and that is, we need a political theory to talk about how to manage those kinds of conflicts. And as I mentioned, I'm not really I haven't really spent enough time thinking about, you know, the political theory as opposed to the social theory, but I'm trying to move toward political theory now with a richer understanding of what the social theory is, because I do think that a lot of political theory happens without a very good sense of what are how the practices work and how they are it's very individualistic, let's say. We're these people with all these separate interests, and we all need, and we fight about it, and so the state has to come in and give us a way to reason together about our interests and satisfying our interests. And I'm like, whoa, you know, that's really problematic. And so I need that. I recognize that I need that in the political. But I do think that you know, you can do a lot of social change with a very minimum amount of conflict, because you can change the material conditions. And I'm not sure I used the example here, but there's been a lot of work recently in the Boston area to make more protected bike lanes, because a lot of people wouldn't ride bikes because it was too dangerous. You could be hit very easily. And so now there's a whole different set of bike lanes that are protected from the traffic, and people are using bikes more rather than using their cars. And then this has a kind of cascading effect, because the more bikes there are, the safer it is, because cars don't, you know, they look out for bikes and such like that. And then this is potentially helpful for climate change issues and that people's awareness and exercise, people are healthier. So there are all of these cascading effects where there didn't have to be a whole lot of conflict, right? That was, so I'm very big on changing the material conditions sort of behind the backs of people who don't like it because they're not paying attention, and you can get change to happen without conflict. And maybe they complain at first, but then they get used to it because they're not paying attention, right? They just get used to it. I think that there's a lot of conflict now over gender and what gender is, and you know, there's a lot of trans backlash. I have trans students and close trans friends who are suffering a lot because of the backlash, and there's an issue of conflict and destabilization of a very old and deep cultural techne of binary gender, and there I don't have a single recipe for how to deal with that conflict. I think it will depend if we're talking about gender, or we're talking about race, we're talking about these other things. There's not going to be a recipe for dealing with it. We have to come up collectively with the people who are most affected, and come and sort of with their guidance move forward with a strategy for a response to that conflict. Because that's something that, you know, politics can do something. It can say, you can't discriminate against trans people, and you can file a lawsuit if they do. But it's not about that, right? It's about recognition, as you say. It's about who am I, and I demand that you take me for who I am. And I think it's just hard to have a general sort of practice for that. You have to think of it historically and culturally. And I think of this especially around race in the US and race in Latin America and race in Europe. Very different phenomena, very different challenges. And how you respond to the demand for recognition has got to be really socio-historically sensitive.
And maybe I might add something that might speak to your question as well. So I mean, when you talk about cooperation and societies as the need for cooperation and so on, I was wondering, and here I'm actually playing the devil's advocate more or less, because I see myself in the same camp here in some way, the way we talked about yesterday. At some point you have the equality demand in this. So we need to cooperate, and all of a sudden the need to cooperate is a need to cooperate on equal terms. And let's say without a certain kind of oppression or domination that needs to be fought in order to get it. And I mean, somehow one could say, you know, aren't there perfect, what kind of normative claim is it that you make here? And what kind of idea of social change and how social change can come about here is implied here? Because one could perfectly argue, I do not, but normally, yeah. But to ask you a question that I'm normally asked, so why wouldn't it be perfectly possible to establish a very functional, very a perfect mode of cooperation on the basis of utterly unequal, like let's say a hierarchical feudal structure, or the kind of chain of command that sometimes produces very stable modes of cooperation and sometimes is even needed. I mean, in an army, you need a chain of command in order to act effectively and so on and so on. So why wouldn't it be, I mean, would you say that in the end, or I mean, in the long term, those unequal modes of cooperation will produce deficits in the cooperation itself, or is it something that just as a value that we should hold on to comes in? And this has something to do with the question of how whether struggle is like fundamental and needed in order to even to make cooperation work or not, and what role does it play?
Thank you so much. So I don't, that's a helpful, very helpful question. So I don't want to say that everybody has to be, I mean, I think teachers, you know, it's right that they have more power in a classroom than the students to some extent because they know more, so they are the ones that get to assign the readings and things like that. And it may be, if we need a military, maybe we don't ultimately, but that there has to be a chain of command. So I think on equal terms is probably it's a pretty thin notion, and let me see if I'm going to be able to say this in a way that I believe it, instead of just a convenient way to answer the question. Do you know what I mean? I mean, that sometimes happens. So this came up when I was at the Free University, and there was a discussion of some of my work, and people were arguing whether I was Kantian or Hegelian, and I was saying, I'm neither Kantian nor Hegelian. Leave me out of that discussion, I'm not either. But there's a part of me, in the past I have suggested that if I'm not included as an equal, then there's a sense in which I'm coerced to live under these conditions, to live on these terms. And I just think coercion is a moral wrong. And so there's a kind of foundational moral wrong, in my view, about we shouldn't have to live under conditions of coercion. And see, I can do that because I think that people who are coerced aren't flourishing. You know, so there's a way that I can go there and get that, but I have to say, I find that there's a way in which I find that words coming out of my mouth that I have to have a deeper understanding of myself and how this picture is supposed to work. So, but that's going to be a central part of it. But the coercion and the flourishing are going to be connected with each other. So let me step back a little bit because it's about the normative stuff. So I believe that human flourishing requires the capacity to value in many ways. We talked about this. So I don't think that values are things that exist somewhere in Plato's heaven. I think values are derivative from our ways of valuing, and there are many ways of valuing. You can value the natural world in a certain way. You can value your partner in a certain way. You can value aesthetic objects or religious experience. These are all different ways of valuing that we have, and that I think that human flourishing, and I think that we can create new ways of valuing things because the world provides us new things and we respond to it in new ways, and there are new ways of valuing. And so it's this kind of dynamic process. And I think, so part of why I think that some systems diminish us is they constrain our ability to value things in these multiple ways. And they prevent us from learning new ways of valuing things. And so that's a kind of the side of the view that is about the good rather than the right. You know, the good for humans is going to be connected to our ability to value things. But then there's going to be the right, that there's constraints, you know, that, you know, we have to treat each other this way and not that way. We have to treat each other as equals. And there are moments where I see myself swerving into this view that, because I want the good and the right to be separate and both, include them both. But I seem to swerve into something like, well, coercion is bad because we don't thrive if we're coerced. And then it looks like I'm kind of all about the good and not enough about the right. And so And I think it's partly because the people in the world that I'm in, they want the right to be Kantian, and they want it to be based in rationality. And if you don't follow the rules, then you're irrational or something like that. And I can't do that. I'm sorry, I can't go there. That doesn't work for me. It's like this, whoa, no, kind of feeling, this sort of unease and anxiety that hits at that point. And so I don't really have a good theory of the right. I just don't. And so I'm sorry, I don't have.
Because maybe if you say more about like changing the material conditions or using the resources that are there in a different way that can be, can be used in the current situation of the system. If you use the resources in a different way, changing sort of the material conditions and doing this ideology critique and sort of changing the social practices that are currently
That's exactly
available.
Yeah.
That's
exactly right.
That's a sort of way of changing the structure, maybe the system, maybe
that's how it's supposed to be.
I listened to you and I was like, when is she going to say this?
It's so if the practices are everything, if they're at the base and everything is built from them, then, and they consist of, the culture and the resources, then you can change the resources and change the culture. That's what we do. And then sometimes you can do it, sometimes there's conflict. Most of the time there's conflict, and sometimes there's just stealth. I'm kind of big on stealth social change myself. We just take power and move it, something like that. But
there's a lot of conflict over traffic.
Yeah, the traffic.
And it somehow aligns. It's really interesting that the far right is, and taking the most irrational positions even against.
There's always conflict, and then the problem. So this is connected to something I said yesterday about in the U.S. The legislature is not how social change and social resistance is happening. It's in the judicial system, because you take something you file a lawsuit and you take it to the Supreme Court, and then the Supreme Court decides, and then so you need lawyers. And you need money. You always need money and things like that. But it's different from how are we going to get a democratic process to bring about change, because the democratic process is broken so badly, because even if you had a change through a democratic process, the Supreme Court would say, no, sorry, we have an interpretation of the original intent of the founding fathers that makes that impossible. And you go,
Yeah, thanks for sharing these wonderful ideas. I love the talk. I think it's more of a clarificatory question, maybe, but let's see. In your view, under what conditions can ideological critique provide a strong moral basis for transformative change? And also, like my second question that's connected, would be how can we ensure that critiques of ideology move beyond merely identifying oppression and actively contributing to dismantling these structures?
Okay, could you repeat the second one?
Yes, of course. So how can we ensure that critiques of ideology move beyond merely identifying oppression to actually actively contributing to dismantling these structures?
Yeah, great. Okay, so, the moral basis, I was trying to say, in principle, the moral basis is about social flourishing, right? Flourishing as part of a social order. Not just individual flourishing, but flourishing together in this historically particular social order. There's so many problems with that because, of course, due to adaptive preferences, people think they're flourishing when actually there's reason to think that they're not. And so, because they don't have a sense of what the possibilities are, or they've adjusted their preferences to what they think is possible. But the way I want to spell this out is think about it in terms of whether their suffering or their joy is based on false presuppositions. So when I'm thinking about the different kinds of suffering, like we were talking about yesterday, the suffering of the white man, or the suffering of the racist, I think that very often there's false presuppositions behind that suffering. You know, they think that they're being treated unfairly. They're not. They're suffering because they think they're being treated unfairly, but it's not true. Yeah, I'm not that worried, right? They think that they're flourishing because they think that this is what's the best possible life for them, but it's not the best possible life. And so we may want to provide some critical perspective on that sense of flourishing. You know, it's tricky, and this is something that I work on with people in the real, in the real world, about opening up the sense of possibility. So when I quoted that Rebecca Solnit about how hope is about having a sense of other possibilities, that's what I want to offer to people in a lot of the work that I do, is a sense that there are possibilities for them that they can take hold of. They can expand their choice architecture so they can see this is another possibility for them, and then help make it real as a possibility for them. Not just say, oh, this could be possible for you if you lived in a different world, you know, like that. But it's both this sense of possibility and resources to help create new practices and new material conditions so those possibilities are really real and not just in the imagination. And so that's about the moral basis for this. About how can we be sure that it's making transformative change rather than just a perturbation in the system? We often don't know. And so that's, again, going back to that quote from Rebecca Solnit, we throw ourselves at it with all we've got. We can't necessarily predict it because we can't see all the ramifications of what we're doing. We can't see the other backlash that's going to come. But, you know, we do our best. We're with openness and learning connected to Rahel. We're open to learning as we go, changing what our sense of possibilities are as we go. And I don't call it, I mean, Solnit, so I have a little thing on hope, but I'm not going to get into it. But Solnit wants to emphasize that hope is not optimism. Hope, and in the Christian tradition, faith was about what you believe, and optimism seems to be about what you believe. But hope is about the will. So the will is what hopes. And so I like this idea of hope, that my will is taken into this fight, into this struggle, to make things better. And I don't have to believe it's going to be better, but my will engage it anyway. And I think that's what Solnit is saying. She's saying, you know, one person may change the world, or her words may do generations later. We don't know. But that doesn't mean that we should just sit on our butts on the sofa with a lottery ticket feeling lucky, as she puts it. We should throw ourselves against the wall, against the door, against whatever. And that's my view.
Any other questions?
Okay, so we actually came up with this question in the reading group, so hopefully I will be able to pose it reasonably.
Fantastic.
So when you describe structural injustice, and I quote, you say, it occurs when the practices that create the structure distort our understanding of what is valuable and organize us in ways that are unjust, harmful, or wrong. But isn't this like something that every society does? And my question then would be, so we thought that it may be a categorical problem to define society with the same normative frame that you use to define structural injustice, but maybe it is not an issue, and you are okay with admitting that society is like intrinsically unjust, or that intrinsically has structural injustices. So I wanted to know what's your stance in there.
Yeah, good. So this is really helpful. Thank you so much for the question. So So I want to distinguish, of course, the cultural techne, allowing some cultural technes can be good, right? There can be ways of being engaging in social practices that are good. They enable us to flourish. We're, happy as we engage in them, et cetera, et cetera. But most of them are not like that. Most of them are more problematic, especially the institutional ones that we have to deal with. And I also think that it's not possible for humans to be sensitive to all of the different things in an environment and be responsive to them. We always are going to have to focus on some things rather than others, pick up certain signals and not others, et cetera. So there's always going to be a restriction in our responsiveness to the world, both for the purposes of coordination, but also just because you can't process everything all the time, right? It's just impossible. So there's going to be limitations, but I don't think that all limitations are bad. I don't think they're all harmful or unjust. I think that they're okay. But what you're posing is, well, yeah, maybe there's some that are okay and we can manage, but when we're trying to organize large societies, won't there always be injustices? Won't there always be ways that our organization is gone wrong, as I put it, is gone wrong? And, everyone that we've ever known or known about, yeah, I think that that's true. I mean, I think you can have a small group who, is working just fine, but when we start getting into big, societies or things like that, or global formations, I don't know how it's going to be able to do it without some ways of restricting us so that we're not all flourishing. I don't know how to do it. Maybe it's inevitable, but at least we can minimize it. At least we can reduce it. And so even if you're saying, oh, well, it's inevitable, so what can you do? I'd say work toward reducing it, work toward changing it for the better, even if there's no utopia. I mean, and I'm not really utopian, and I don't think about reaching an utopia. I think about, this comes back to the negative. My view is, let's try and make it better. And you make it better step by step by step, and then you realize, oh shit, that didn't work. It was totally backfired. And then you go back to the drawing board and say, okay, let's try it again. Boom. And so it's a Deweyan sort of experimentalism that's involved here.
Yes, can we say that societies are intrinsically unjust?
I guess I would say that, historically that's our experience. And I think they can be made more just than they have been in the past. Most of them anyway. I don't know all of them. I haven't tested all of the societies. But I do think that there's a possibility that you're never. So Rawls has this funny quote, and I'm not a Rawls fan, whatever. But he has this, and I used it in a paper. I might have used it in the associationist paper about. He talks about, even if we had a perfectly just structure, society would still go bad. And he talks about the invisible hand that makes things go bad. And I'm like, whoa, that's not Smith's invisible hand, because Adam Smith thinks that we all just follow our rational preferences and then, it's all going to be beautiful and whatever. What's the invisible hand that is making things go bad, no matter what we do, no matter how we do it? And I think, and he doesn't really have a good answer to that question. And it could be, I don't know. It could be that there's always something there, and maybe scarcity. It may be just that that's always going to mean that we're become competitive, that we always are going to, not, maybe something about human nature. I don't like to say anything about humans is fixed, but maybe that under conditions of scarcity. So Liz Anderson has this view that under bad conditions, people lose their epistemic powers, right? They start doing stuff that are bad, and that they don't they don't act on their knowledge. I don't know, maybe, but I don't have I don't know.
Would you like to answer some of the
Oh, yes,
topics?
would you like to say more about the administrative, or anything else?
Now I was tempted to say something about the justice question when you were talking. No, I was asking myself if the appearance that the world is necessarily unjust comes of our I think is due to the negative sense of justice. Like the idea of absolute justice only can appear if we relate in a way of determinate negation to unjust conditions. So it's like the idea that there's something like an absolute full justice possible can only is only due to our perception of injustice. So yeah, this was what I was thinking when you two were talking, and then I can maybe, because I think what I didn't make clear was the thing with technology. What I meant with the focus on technique and technology. Now that you were talking about social change and the bike lanes, it came to my mind that perhaps the changes that can be brought about with a minimum amount of conflict might be the changes that are not systemical. And I mean, society is constantly changing. Sometimes there is more intention in it, and sometimes it somehow happens automatically. And I mean, capitalism is known as the system that changes everything the whole time in order to maintain everything the same. So yeah, that's maybe just an idea that maybe if you look at the changes only in techniques, even if it's social techniques, then it might be not these transformative changes. And I think somehow I heard that we agreed there, no? Yeah, I only wanted to say that I totally agree with your hope in the dark approach. I find it very important not to confuse hope with optimism, and not with to insist that hoping doesn't mean that there's a guarantee for anything, but on the contrary, hoping means maybe even seeing that the possibilities are quite small, and that even more so we have to fight for them.
So yeah, I think that a big question is, how do we get to the point where the change isn't just a small change that's just accommodated, but it's truly transformative? And I think my view about this is that we have to work kind of, and this is connected to some things that Rahel's talking about. You have to be able to see how your intervention here is connected to the bigger picture. And it's oftentimes really hard to know what that bigger picture is going to look like. So, but I think that there's this meso level. So there's the micro level that's like individuals interacting with each other in their particular practices or something like that. And then there's a meso level where I think of transportation systems and medical systems and criminal justice systems, and there are a variety, education systems, all these different systems that are co-integrated. So they're feeding, they're supporting each other in injustice and in badness, that, and there's no way to address them all at once. And you can only kind of think about intervening in one, recognizing that it's co-integrated with these other ones. So there are going to be these consequences for the other systems, and hoping that the consequences are going to be better consequences. So intervening in the child protective services. So instead of removing children from their homes, you provide financial support to mothers and things like this. Well, that's good for that family, but you have to see about what that's going to do in the criminal justice system, because it'll have repercussions for that, or the health system, it has repercussions for that. And the thought might be that in a movement, what we have to do is we have to have people in these various different systems that we can keep communicating with and sort of monitoring what's going on, so that we can see the likely ripple effects and counter them or reinforce them or something like that. Because if we want transformative change, it's going to have to affect a lot of different systems and not just one system. But that's really hard to do.
We've got like 5 minutes left, a real 5 minutes. Okay. Is that fine? Okay.
So very short, I was thinking like something like this is behind the view, for example, or the project of fearless cities.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've heard.
I
mean,
haven't,
this
but
idea
that, yeah, I
that
can
cities must connect. They have to learn from each other. That cities can change the system or relevant aspects of the system. I think there's something like that in this kind of view, no? And I don't know, Barcelona, for example, is a very good example of that. In many ways, like they have changed the way, for example, people see what streets are made for and what streets are supposed to mean and so on. And this really changes subjectivities, changes perceptions. And so from a local and meso level, et cetera, et cetera. So I really think that this is a kind of approach. I think it's a very promising kind of approach. I just wanted to say that. Yeah.
It also, it derives from, my son works in community safety, and it used to be that was it was called public safety, and it was about the police. And like the police come in and try and make sure people aren't doing criminal things. But now in this move to community safety, they're trying to bring together, because violence is a product of deeper problems. It's like homelessness and food insecurity and drug addiction and, all of these different things. And so if you work together, get these systems and healthcare and all of this working together, then you have a more systematic change in what the options are for people who are desperate, right? Because it often would be they're desperate. They go in and rob a store because they don't have any money and they can't buy food for their kids or whatever. Sometimes it's more pernicious than that. I'm not trying to glorify and romanticize criminals like they're really awful, but there are ways in which you can think about the integration of these systems as you can be sensitive to the way that they're integrated and be changing them in ways that integration is better, because they're already integrated, right? The failure of the healthcare system and the housing system and whatever has implications for criminal justice. And so they're already integrated. But if you think about how changes in some of them can flip to a more positive feedback loop. The positive feedback loops, remember, the ones that switch you to a new equilibrium. The negative feedback loops are the ones that keep you in the system. And so you're trying to get that co-integration to sort of move you to a new place. And I think that we can see that in some places that's what they're doing.
Wouldn't you say that one of our debates, namely about the local and the more than local, is something that we could make peace about?
Yeah. I think so. I think so.
Because the strawman would be, you always want to fight capitalism and go for the anti-capitalist revolution, but we do real things here, on the ground. And that doesn't seem to be an adequate picture anymore, I would say. At least not on the theoretical level, but also really not on the practical level, because, and then this question, the question of how things then hang together on what you would call the system level, on how things affect each other. You can take those questions further and further, and sometimes you will find out that some of those obstacles. And again, I would like to start from the obstacles and the crisis and the contradictions. Some of the obstacles that you experience when you try to change things that in some way are so, to make the city safer for bikes, or to make the city safer so that our kids can go to school without I mean, without coming home dead, not coming home anymore, is something, I mean, you just don't understand why doesn't it work. And for example, in Berlin, it somehow doesn't. I mean, there is real conflict about one street and bike lanes on this street. And I know from Valencia, which has a beautiful bike system, as I saw when I was there, that there's really, I mean, this political debate between, I mean, the right wing and the left, and some of those things, like riding a bike is seen as liberal. I mean, also in Germany, this whole debate about, I mean, so you have all those liberals who ride a bike, and we are the ones who go for the car.
Social meetings.
So social meetings, yeah. So it's all, I mean, it's overdetermined. And at the same time, it has something to do with the car industry to be, I mean, fundamental for economics in a lot of countries of ours, and so on and so on. So I would say you get to so-called capitalism, I mean, step by step. Not always, sometimes. It doesn't mean that you can't change, that you can't introduce bike lanes without first having overcome capitalism, but sometimes this is the case, that you just didn't realize that there are like power structures, obstacles that have a reason, that are not just because people don't see that this would be a great idea that you have, but there's more to it. And yeah, so, and again, I think we can make peace on this point.
One really quick, just follow up. There's pushback from the right, but my son, who works on urban violence, criminology, that sort of stuff, he gets so pissed at Cambridge because there are gangs in Cambridge, there's violence in Cambridge, and he says, they made another damn bike lane, and so he's just worried about, Cambridge is all about bike lanes and planting trees, and he says they're not really looking at, and they want to see themselves as this kind of liberal city with all these happy, eco-friendly, Harris-supporting people, but they're not really dealing with the racism and with the violence that's happening in the housing projects and that's happening whatever, and so it's a cover for these deeper problems, and he gets really mad about it. So I hear you, but it's from the other side. Instead of don't spend your money on bike lanes, you need to have these systems that feed. You do both, right? But sometimes financially you have to make a choice. And his view is you need more healthcare, housing, food security. These are more, and I agree. I mean, it used to be back in the day that people would come and ask me to give money to eco-friendly, and I'd say, well, I'm going to give you just a little bit because I'm really putting my money into, food security and these things because I think, and they would say, but they're connected, and I would say, yes, I know they're connected. Anyway, thank you, everybody. Thank you to my commentators especially. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I have lots of notes of things I need to think more about.